Under the burning Texas sun of August 2nd, 1944, the wind carried the scent of dust, cattle, and something unexpected, sizzling bacon. At Camp Hearn, one of the largest German POW camps in the United States, the morning began like any other. Reveille at dawn, guards checking fences, and prisoners gathering for roll call. But as smoke rose from the camp kitchen that day, a strange silence spread across the compound. The prisoners, men who once wore the grey of the Wehrmacht, turned their heads toward the smell. Pork fat crackling in a cast-iron skillet. To many of them, it was the first time in years they'd smelled home. U.S. Army Camp Command Report, AUG 1944. The cooks in the mess hall were not soldiers but ranch hands, Texans conscripted by circumstance to feed the enemy. Among them was Private Carl Jennings, a 22-year-old former farmhand from Waco who had lost his brother in North Africa. For months, Jennings had refused to look at the German prisoners as men, calling them Krauts and Nazis. But that morning, as he stirred the pan, he watched one of the prisoners, a blond kid barely older than himself, close his eyes at the smell. Jennings paused. The boy looked starved for memory, not food. Personal Diary, PFCC Jennings, AUG 1944. Camp Hearn sat in the heart of Texas farmland, 130 miles north of Houston, surrounded by barbed wire and the open plains. Built to hold 4,800 German soldiers, it housed veterans from North Africa and Italy, men captured under Rommel's Africa Corps. They spent their days laboring in cotton fields and ranches, earning 80 cents a day. Wages never handed to them directly, of course, but recorded in the books. War Department Circular 7, 1943. It was an odd contradiction. Enemy soldiers helping feed America's home front. Yet under the Geneva Convention, they were entitled to humane treatment, something the War Department enforced with near-obsessive care, if only to ensure American POWs in Europe were treated the same. For Texans, this created tension. Many had lost sons, husbands, or brothers overseas. They couldn't understand why the enemy got hot meals, while ration coupons still ruled local life. Bryan Eagle newspaper, AUG 1944. Still, orders were orders, and so the men worked side by side, German prisoners picking cotton, Texans driving trucks under the same sun, their sweat mixing in the same dirt. That morning, a new shipment of rations arrived from the Quartermaster Depot in Dallas, flour, coffee, beans, and a few crates labeled bacon, salted. 1943, the bacon wasn't special. It had been sitting in storage for months, rationed out to military kitchens. But to the Germans, it was a symbol of life before war. Bacon was scarce in their ration packs overseas, and back home, the Allied blockade had turned such luxuries into legend. U.S. Quartermaster Supply Record 1944. Inside the mess hall, Jennings laid strips of bacon on the skillet, the fat popping, the smell rising. The German prisoners on kitchen duty watched in disbelief. One of them, Obergefreiter Heinrich Krüger, had been a farmer near Bremen before the war. He spoke decent English. "Bacon?" he asked softly. Jennings nodded but didn't speak. Krüger smiled faintly, a kind of fragile gratitude flickering across his face. For a moment, the uniform didn't matter. When breakfast was served, eggs, bread, and 2 small pieces of bacon per man, the camp fell utterly silent. Prisoners who had survived desert campaigns, naval bombardments, and Allied strafing sat with tears in their eyes. Some prayed before eating. Others simply stared at the meat as if it might vanish. "For 2 years we had nothing like this," one prisoner wrote later in a letter home intercepted by censors. "It tasted like peace." U.S. Censorship Summary, 1944. Jennings watched from behind the counter. The sound of chewing filled the air, a strange, almost sacred quiet. Then one of the older prisoners stood, lifted his cap and said in broken English, "Thank you, Texas." No one laughed. No one jeered. The guards didn't even move. It was as though every man in that room on both sides of the wire suddenly felt the same exhaustion, the same longing to go home. Outside, a lone cowbell clanged from the ranch pasture. The smell of bacon drifted through the wire and into the fields where other prisoners were working. Some stopped mid-pick, craning their necks toward the camp, unsure if what they smelled was real. For a brief moment, the boundaries blurred. A few American guards admitted later they'd looked away to wipe their eyes. Oral History Collection, Camp Hearn Museum. In the command office, Captain Raymond Bledsoe, the camp's officer in charge, wrote a terse note to his superior. POWs expressed deep emotional reaction to this morning's breakfast. No disturbance reported. Morale unusually high. U.S. Army Administrative Log, Aug. 2, 1944. He didn't mention the tears, the sudden quiet, or the way his own voice had cracked when he gave orders that morning. What no one realized then was that this simple breakfast had rippled beyond the camp. Local newspapers, forbidden from printing sensitive details, still caught wind of the bacon story. Word spread quietly across Texas towns that the Germans had cried when given bacon. Some citizens were furious. Others felt something they hadn't felt in years: empathy. Dallas Morning News, Aug. 1944. Later that day, Kruger approached Jennings again as the mess hall closed. He pointed toward the frying pan, now blackened with grease. "In my home," he said. "My wife cooked this on Sunday." Jennings stared at him for a long time, then muttered, "Mine too." The two men didn't shake hands, but they didn't need to. The war had built walls of ideology and blood, yet here in a Texas mess hall, a few pieces of bacon had done what guns never could. They reminded men of their shared humanity. As night fell, the cicadas began their endless song, and the camp lights flickered on across the fences. Inside the barracks, the prisoners lay awake, whispering about home, wives, and children. Some sang softly in German lullabies from their youth. Bundesarchiv, POW letter archive. Jennings, meanwhile, sat outside the kitchen staring at the stars. He wondered what his brother, buried under Tunisian sand, would think of all this. Would he have understood? Or would he have cursed him for showing kindness to the enemy? The bacon grease still clung to his hands. He rubbed his palms together, as if trying to erase it, but the smell wouldn't fade. Somewhere between guilt and grace, he realized something the war had hidden from both sides. Mercy was not weakness. It was survival. By midnight, the camp had gone quiet. Only the Texas wind moved through the barbed wire, whispering across two worlds, one of captivity, one of uneasy freedom. What began as a simple breakfast had become something else entirely, a fragile truce of the heart, born not of treaties or orders, but of hunger and memory. And as dawn approached, a radio crackled in the command office with news from Europe. The Allies were closing in on Paris. War Department signal dispatch. 1944. In Texas, far from the thunder of guns, the prisoners slept soundly for the first time in years. The war would rage on, but something had changed that day on the ranch. Something neither side could name yet, but both could feel. 2 weeks after the bacon breakfast, the morning sun rose over Camp Hearn with a quiet calm that seemed to hang heavier than the Texas humidity itself. To most guards, it was just another day in a war they watched from a distance. But to Captain Raymond Bledsoe, something in the camp had changed. The German prisoners, men who once carried the rigid discipline of the Wehrmacht, now spoke with softer voices, worked with steadier hands, and looked their captors in the eye. The war hadn't ended, but something invisible had shifted behind the wire. U.S. Army Psychological Observation Report, Aug. 1944. What no one outside the fences knew was that this change was not just emotional, it was logistical. The U.S. Army's prisoner program was built on quiet, calculated efficiency, a system that turned enemies into workers without breaking their spirit. And Camp Hearn was one of its most carefully engineered examples. Designed by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the camp operated like a miniature town. Electricity, plumbing, workshops, a theater, and even a small library built from donations by Texas locals. Engineering Division Construction Blueprint, 1943. It was a strange fusion of war and civility, a machine of captivity powered by American precision. Behind that civility, however, lay one of the war's lesser-known military secrets: the U.S. logistical machine that could feed, house, and manage hundreds of thousands of prisoners without chaos. Each crate of food, each bolt of fabric, each bar of soap traveled through a labyrinth of army supply routes run by the Quartermaster Corps, a network that rivaled the very front-line operations of Europe. Quartermaster General Report, 1944. To feed the enemy, the army had to master the art of abundance in the middle of global scarcity. At Camp Hearn, refrigeration was the heart of that system. Hidden behind the mess hall, a massive walk-in cold room built by the Frigidaire division of General Motors kept meat and dairy fresh for over 4,000 men. Using ammonia-based compressors capable of maintaining 34 degrees Celsius in Texas heat, it was one of the camp's most advanced installations. Technical Manual TM 5814, 1943. When the bacon shipment arrived, those compressors had done more than preserve food. They had preserved dignity. The ability to give POWs fresh meat instead of canned rations wasn't sentiment. It was strategy. Morale, even among enemies, was a resource. Engineers like Sergeant John Holloway, an electrician from El Paso, maintained that cold room tirelessly. "Those compressors never sleep," he wrote in his maintenance log. "If they go down, the whole camp goes sour." Maintenance record, Camp Hearn, Og 1944. Holloway didn't know it, but his work kept the Geneva Convention alive in steel and refrigerant lines. The entire operation was part of what U.S. planners called controlled humanity, balance between strength and fairness, designed to project American power without cruelty. German prisoners often marveled at the precision of it all. One of them, a mechanic named Wilhelm Albrecht, once told his barracks mates that American logistics were a second front of their own. Bundesarchiv, POW Diary, 1944. And he wasn't wrong. Behind every frontline victory, Normandy, Saipan, or Anzio, stood the same system that kept Camp Hearn running: fleets of trucks, rail depots, assembly lines, and refrigeration units. It was industrial compassion backed by mathematics. But there was another layer: communication. American POW camps were linked through a vast network of telegrams, phone lines, and radio dispatches. Motorola engineers under government contract had installed short-range field radios, allowing camp officers to coordinate supply convoys and emergencies. The same technology that helped GIs call for artillery in Europe kept the Texas camps synchronized. Signal Corps Communication Log, 1944. It was a quiet proof of concept for what the Army would later call networked warfare, the Germans noticed. In their own way, they studied it. Prisoners trained as engineers began sketching the camp's layouts, power systems, even the distribution patterns of supplies. But rather than plotting escape, most did it out of fascination. "Their efficiency astonishes me," one wrote. "It is war without hate, order without cruelty." PAMU interrogation transcript, 45. For men raised on Nazi propaganda about American chaos, the organized kindness was disarming. Then came the drought of September 1944. The heat climbed past 100 degrees Celsius, and local water reserves fell dangerously low. Nearby ranchers began cutting back livestock feed. Tempers flared. Camp Hearn's supply lines stretched thin. Refrigeration units faltered under the strain. Bacon, butter, and meat spoiled in neighboring camps. Brazos County Agricultural Report, 1944. But Hearn's cold room kept running, the compressors humming like iron lungs. Holloway and his crew worked 12-hour shifts to keep the system alive, using scavenged copper piping and salvaged fan motors. Army Engineering Memo, Sept. 1944. Their success meant the difference between resentment and revolt. That same month, an incident tested the fragile balance of humanity. During a supply delay, the camp received only canned beans and hardtack. When the Germans lined up for breakfast, there was no meat. Murmurs spread through the crowd, anger, confusion, hunger. Tension rippled through the mess hall. Then, just as tempers threatened to spark, Private Jennings stepped forward and addressed them in halting German. "Tomorrow, bacon again, I promise." It wasn't protocol, but it was enough. The prisoners nodded silently and returned to their barracks. Guard Duty Log, Sept. 9, 1944. Jennings kept that promise. The next morning, the cold room yielded its last slabs of salted pork. As the smell of frying meat spread once again, calm returned. The officers saw it as a small success in morale management. But to the prisoners, it was proof that mercy could repeat itself. "The Americans kept their word," wrote Kruger in a note home. "Not by treaty, but by frying pan." Bundesarchiv POW Letter Archive, Sept. 1944. Even as the war turned against Germany, the camp's routine remained mechanical and precise. Trucks from Dallas arrived every Thursday. Workshops repaired their own equipment using recycled tractor parts. The camp's German carpenters even built furniture for local schools. a quiet reconciliation paid in craftsmanship. Hearn County Education Board Record 1945. To Bledsoe, this order had become its own battlefield, a place where discipline replaced gunfire. He once told a visiting colonel, "You fight men differently when they're no longer trying to kill you." Command Inspection Report, Oct. 1944. The colonel nodded unimpressed, but later wrote in his notes that Hearn demonstrates a curious American philosophy, control through compassion. The bacon breakfast had become legend inside the camp. Prisoners spoke of it like a holy day, the moment when guards became human and enemies became men. When a new batch of POWs arrived from North Africa that fall, the story spread to them within hours. "Wait," one newcomer asked, "they served you bacon?" "Real bacon?" The others nodded. "And we cried," Kruger said simply. POW Oral History 1945. By winter, those same prisoners began sending handcrafted gifts to the guards: wooden carvings, small crosses, model airplanes made from scrap aluminum. It wasn't surrender. It was acknowledgement. Something had cracked in the armor of hate, replaced by a strange practical fraternity. Even Bledsoe, hardened by months of duty, kept one of the carvings on his desk. A tiny pig, hand-sanded smooth. Still, the war outside the fences raged on. Reports from Europe filled the radio room. Paris liberated. Allied bombers reaching the Rhine, the Red Army pushing west. Each victory brought cheers from the guards and silence from the prisoners. Yet that silence no longer felt like bitterness. It was something deeper: resignation, relief. The war was ending, but no one knew what home meant anymore. On Christmas Eve 1944, the camp's mess hall hosted a joint service. Americans and Germans sang hymns together under strings of bare light bulbs. In one corner, Jennings handed out coffee to the prisoners, who nodded in quiet gratitude. The final hymn echoed through the rafters: "Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht." Some sang in English, some in German, but the tune was the same. Chaplin's log, Deck 1944. As the last note faded, Bledsoe looked across the hall at rows of men once sworn to destroy his country, now weeping softly in the glow of electric light. He didn't smile. He just whispered to himself, "Maybe this is how wars really end." Outside, frost formed on the barbed wire, glinting like 1,000 tiny bayonets. Inside, warmth lingered from the stoves, from the bacon that had become legend, from the fragile, mechanical mercy that held an army of enemies together. But across the Atlantic, in the frozen forests of Belgium, the Battle of the Bulge was beginning, and soon, the news from Europe would test every fragile lesson Camp Hearn had built. January 1945. The Battle of the Bulge was raging across Europe, and the camp radios at Hearn crackled day and night with grim news from the Ardennes. Prisoners listened in silence as reports filtered through: German counterattacks, Allied lines collapsing, and thousands of men dying in the snow. The guards turned down the volume, but the POWs already knew. Their homeland was burning, and many feared their families were somewhere beneath those bombs. U.S. Signal Corps radio log, Jan 1945, inside Camp Hearn, the mood changed again. The men who had once cried over bacon now worked in a strange rhythm of gratitude and grief. They sang less, laughed less, but obeyed more. Captain Bledsoe saw it in their faces each morning. The war was ending for them. Not with a bang, but with a long, suffocating silence. He kept the camp running anyway. Drills, rations, repairs, inspections. Routine was the only thing that kept despair from spreading. Command Inspection Report, Jan 1945. By spring, that despair gave way to acceptance. Letters from the Red Cross brought the truth in cold official language. Germany was collapsing. Hamburg gone. Dresden ash. Berlin surrounded. And in April, the message came: Hitler was dead. Some prisoners cheered in relief. Others sat down and wept openly. Kruger, the same man who'd once cried over bacon, now stared through the fence at the horizon and said nothing for days. He looked at freedom and didn't know what it meant anymore, Bledsoe wrote in his personal log. Personal Diary, Captain R. Bledsoe, Ypres, 1945. When victory finally came in May, Hearn erupted in confusion. The guards cheered VE Day. The Germans stood in stunned silence, then clapped slowly, almost respectfully. For months they had been living inside the enemy's mercy, and now that mercy had outlasted the Reich itself. The camp transformed overnight, from a place of control to a refuge of lost men. Radios blared swing music. Trucks brought ice cream, fresh bread, even more bacon. The smell of grease and sugar hung in the air like a peace offering. U.S. Army Morale Operations Report, May 1945. Then came the question no one was ready to face. What happens next? Repatriation, processing, interrogation. The war was over, but the system had to unwind itself. The same logistics that once fed the enemy now had to send them home. Engineers, clerks, drivers, everyone went to work converting prison camps into transit hubs. War Department Circular 155, May 1945. In Hearn, refrigeration units once used for rations now stored Red Cross aid packages. Barracks became classrooms. Prisoners learned English, carpentry, and farming under American instructors. Post-war training program report 1945. The U.S. government saw it as a psychological experiment in rebuilding men instead of nations. Re-education through responsibility, one memo called it. War Department Psychological Warfare Division, June 1945. For men like Kruger, it worked. He began teaching younger prisoners how to repair small engines, using old tractor parts from the camp's maintenance yard. The Americans noticed his talent and let him run a workshop. Within months, he had built a functioning generator from scrap. "I was a soldier," he wrote in his journal, "but here I became a man again." Bundesarchiv POW Diary 1945. Meanwhile, Bledsoe prepared for closure. His logs were filled with inventory tallies, final headcounts, and endless paperwork. But one entry stood out, a brief note dated August 2nd, 1945. "Served bacon again today." Kruger asked for seconds. "Said it tastes like memory." Camp Hearn Officer Log, Aug. 1945. That same week, 2 atomic bombs would fall on Japan. The world was moving forward, fast and merciless, but in that Texas camp, time seemed to pause, just for breakfast. When the Germans finally left in late 1945, they walked out in neat columns, their uniforms faded, their boots worn. American guards stood at attention, saluting quietly. Kruger turned to Jennings before boarding the truck and pressed something into his hand. A small wooden pig carved smooth, the same one Bledsoe had once admired. "For the bacon," Kruger said simply, then climbed aboard. POW Repatriation Log, Deck 1945. Decades later, the legacy of Camp Hearn would fade into quiet footnotes, overshadowed by the grand narratives of D-Day and Hiroshima. But historians who dug deeper found something profound in those records. The camp had one of the lowest incident rates in the entire US POW system. No riots, no escapes, no executions. Just order, work, and an unexpected tenderness born from the simple act of feeding the enemy. U.S. Army Historical Division Report 1951. Military analysts later drew lessons from it. The humane efficiency of the POW system, its refrigeration, supply chains, and communication networks, became blueprints for Cold War logistics. The same principles of control through compassion reappeared in Korea, Vietnam, and even Iraq, where American planners cited Camp Hearn protocols as historical precedent for humane management. U.S. Army Field Manual FM 1940-1965. Psychologists studied it too. The bacon effect, they called it half-jokingly, a model of emotional disarmament through shared experience. Feeding the enemy became not just a gesture, but a weapon of empathy. Strategic Studies Quarterly 1982. It proved that power didn't always need to humiliate to dominate, that sometimes compassion could conquer where bullets failed. Kruger eventually returned to Bremen, rebuilt his family home, and opened a small mechanics shop. In 1963, he mailed a letter to Hearn, addressed simply to Private Jennings, U.S. Army. The letter read, "When I smell bacon, I remember your country, not for its guns but for its mercy." Private collection, Jennings Family Archive. Jennings had long since left the army, but his grandson later found the letter folded inside a tin box alongside a wooden pig and a faded photograph of Camp Hearn's mess hall. Today, the camp's foundations lie half buried in Texas soil. Weeds grow through cracked concrete, and the old refrigeration pit is filled with rainwater. But if you listen closely on quiet mornings, Locals say you can still smell something faint in the wind: salt, smoke, and memory. Hearn Historical Preservation Society, Oral Archive 2014. That day in 1944 wasn't just a breakfast. It was a battlefield without blood, a small rebellion against hatred itself, a moment when war paused long enough for men to remember they were human. And in the grand machinery of World War II, the tanks, the bombers, the logistics, it was a reminder of the smallest, most powerful weapon of all: mercy. Because sometimes a victory isn't won with rifles or flags. Sometimes it's earned in silence over a hot skillet, when a man offers his enemy a plate of bacon and both of them begin to cry. U.S. Army Oral History Project 1947